Hey everyone, welcome to my comprehensive ES&P/Geography 101 exam number 2 study video. I hope you learned something, so let's get started. Okay, our first topic on the menu is ecosystem services. Right here I just have the textbook definition, which is services desired by people that are provided by an ecosystem. And some examples of that would be fertility of soil in which crops are grown, detoxification of waste and flowing streams, moderation of floods by vegetation slopes. I'd just like to apologize for a little bit of a slow start, but this is all kind of important. I promise it gets a little bit less definition-y as time goes on. Okay, so here's some subsections of the ecosystem services. So we have the provisioning ecosystem services, which are products obtained from ecosystems, and these include food, fuel wood, fiber, biochemicals, and genetic resources, which we can use to find cures to diseases. Then we have the regulating ecosystem services, which are benefits obtained from regulation of ecosystem processes, which would include regulating climate so that we don't die in a fiery inferno, regulating disease so that we don't die from the bubonic plague, and regulating water so that the water doesn't taste nasty and we don't die from poisoned water. Then water purification, pollination by bees and butterflies and other pollinating bugs. Storm protection and erosion control, and as we'll see later on, erosion is being a really big grand challenge right now, and especially in these last couple of chapters that'll be tested on the exam. Then we have the cultural ecosystem services. I promise there's only a couple left, and these are the non-material benefits gained from ecosystems, which include spiritual and religious reasons, recreation and ecotourism, which also directly leads to the economy because of the revenue from the tourism, aesthetic reasons, inspirational reasons, and educational reasons. And obviously you don't have to know all these examples, it's just good to have a couple in your back pocket. And lastly, supporting ecosystem services, services necessary for the production of all other ecosystem services, which would include soil formation, nutrient cycling, and primary production. Primary production is a little more complicated and it won't be tested on this exam, so don't worry about it. Okay, keystone species. So what's important to know about the keystone species, it's really just the most important species in an ecosystem. So it affects every other organism in that ecosystem. For example, right here, we have the bees saying, when I die out, your food doesn't get pollinated and you die. So that's how the bee affects us as humans, but then the bee is also affecting plants because it pollinates them and they would all die. So the bee is pretty important. Another important example is the wolf in Yellowstone, the gray wolf, who back in the 1920s, there was a government policy that allowed the extermination of Yellowstone's gray wolf because it was getting into crops and stuff, and that was making people in agriculture pretty mad. But this was bad because then the elk population exploded because they didn't have a primary predator anymore. Therefore, because the elk was out there just being in bigger population groups than ever, the beavers basically just disappeared because the elk is the predator of the beaver, and other plant and animal species were affected because dams were disintegrating, ponds were turned into streams, and just all sorts of crazy things went on. Getting rid of the wolf was bad, and it's important really just to know that the gray wolf was the keystone species in Yellowstone because that's a really important example. You don't have to know all the extra details about other organisms affected. Okay, now we're going to be talking about some important places that will definitely be on this exam. We're starting off with the Three Gorges Dam. Not so gorgeous because it cost $37 billion to build and submerged thousands of cities, towns, and villages. Some more negative effects of the dam is that landslides are being caused because of increased pressure on surrounding land. There's been a rise in waterborne disease. For a more specific example, the snails are breeding faster in the dam, and these snails are carrying a blood parasite that could be really deadly for humans. And lastly, decline in biodiversity, which is a big overarching theme. The dam is isolating some plants and animals from their ecosystems, and half of China's plant and animal species are found exclusively there. Next important place, Madagascar. Look at all the happy animals in Madagascar from the movie. Ooh, not so happy anymore, unfortunately, because there's only 17% of the original forest in Madagascar left. The biodiversity has gone down greatly. It's declined by more than 25% in the last 35 years. And the majority of 200,000 species that live in Madagascar are found nowhere else in the world. So why is this happening? Okay, so we're starting first with the natural cause, invasive species. The water hyacinth is an invasive species. Sorry for the weird pronunciation of that flower name. And it's causing a reduction of biodiversity in freshwater ecosystems by killing other organisms. And it's also increasing siltation, which is polluting the water by increased amounts of silt and clay. And this obviously affects the drinking water because clay, silty water is gross. And it is also blocking the light from entering the water, which is killing organisms living in it. And their rotting corpses are depleting the water of oxygen. Okay, the next cause is a human cause, overpopulation. There was a rapid population growth back in the 1940s as vaccines lowered the death rate, and these bigger populations are causing a bigger strain on environmental resources. The population grew from 4.2 million to 9.2 million in the 1940s, which resulted in 4 million hectares of forest cleared. Another human cause, soil erosion. There is an annual soil loss of 100 tons per acre in Madagascar, this is the largest amount of soil loss recorded anywhere in the world. And this is obviously exacerbated by deforestation, and erosion decreases quality of soil, which thus reduces plant biodiversity, but also increases sedimentation, which leads to decrease in biodiversity of aquatic organisms. So that's kind of that theme of a world without edges. Everything affects something else. And economic cause is mining. Many companies have established mines in Madagascar to exploit their many resources, and the mining is tearing up 1,300 to 1,700 hectares of land, and this land contains thousands of species of plants and animals. Lastly, a political/socioeconomic cause of this disaster in Madagascar is the March 2009 coup. The coup left Madagascar without a government for quite some time, so a bunch of illegal loggers came in from different places around the world, including the United States. For example, Gibson Qatar was accused of being a part of this, and they ransacked Madagascar, which affected 27,000 to 40,000 acres of previously protected rainforest, which is really sad. The extra sad part is that places such as France were totally on board with this. So Kiribati is known for its subsistence lifestyle. The island itself was funded by proceeds of phosphate mining, so completely self-sufficient, but unfortunately the island is slowly being submerged underwater. And this is quite interesting because the residents of Kiribati could become some of the first climate refugees, which is basically just people who are displaced from their homes because of the effects of climate change, which is really sad. This is another similar situation in which a 1 meter sea level rise is expected by the century's end, and that'll displace about 3.5 to 5 million residents. So I don't know what we're going to do with all those climate refugees, but we'll have to figure out pretty soon. Okay, the Pacific Garbage Patch. This is a floating pile of trash in the Pacific Ocean, and it's a result of trash being dumped there after being transported away from the United States, with basically the out of sight, out of mind mentality. This garbage patch is larger than Mexico. Right here I have an example of reference to The Office. So there's in this picture, Dwight is looking around at all the trash in the dump, and he says, "Wow, amazing, isn't it? No other animal on Earth could do this. Maybe beavers, but not like this." So he's basically referencing to the fact that the garbage that we create is so different from animals and plants, because garbage for animals and plants is like leaves and like petals off of flowers, which obviously will decompose pretty quickly, but plastic and cardboard is not going to decompose that quickly. Okay, Colorado River. The most important thing to know about the Colorado River is that it stopped floating to the San Cortez Sea in the 90s. Footprints. Yay! Okay, so we'll start off with the definition of ecological footprint. It just measures humanity's demands on nature by estimating the amount of resources required to sustain consumption patterns and absorb waste byproducts. Okay, water footprints. So I would say the only important thing to know about water footprint is know the water footprint of a product, which is just the volume of fresh water used to produce a product summed over various steps of the production chain. Know that green water footprint is the volume of rainwater evaporated, blue water footprint is the volume of surface and groundwater evaporated, and gray water footprint is the volume of polluted water. Agriculture. A lot to unpack here. Agriculture began about several thousand years ago from the range of 4,500 to 10,500 current time AD. And what happened was we shifted from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle in which there was a much larger variety of plants and animals consumed to a more narrow group of plants and animals with agriculture, which thus decreased biodiversity and decreased our resilience to crop viruses. Okay, so now we're going to go over the difference and impact of a meat eater versus a vegetarian. So the biggest difference is just that it takes significantly more water to feed and grow livestock than it does for plants. And the containment of animals is sometimes inhumane and can cause a wider spread of disease since they're in such close quarters. And that's really the biggest thing, is just the situation with the water. It takes a lot more resources to feed and grow an animal so it can be ready for consumption than it does for plants. Okay, now we're going to talk about extinction versus extirpation. Extinction is just basically hitting the delete button on one specific species all over the world, while extirpation is doing that, but only for the species, but only in one specific area of the world. That would be like the panda going extinct, but only in China, but there's other pandas in other parts of the world. We're actually currently in the 6th wave mass extinction. That's what scientists are saying, which is kind of sad, but it's how it be. What are we supposed to do? And it's important to note that the cause of decline in mammal species is a result of over-exploitation and unsustainable use of the land that we have. Another important thing to know about extinction is the background rate of extinction, which is just on average 10 to 100 species go extinct naturally every year, but we're really far exceeding those numbers now, so it's not so natural anymore. Okay, Malthusian catastrophe. Right here I have this meme of Kip from Napoleon Dynamite saying, "Thomas Malthus says we're all gonna die." So I guess you could say things are getting pretty serious. The Malthusian catastrophe occurs when the means of sustenance are not enough to support the population, resulting in population reduction through actual or predicted famine. So just know that definition. Okay, now we're going to talk about urbanization. Here are some fun memes. We're going to talk about the positive and negative effects. Some positive effects are that population growth is lower, infant mortality is lower, education is higher, water is more accessible, sanitation is improved, and more people have access to electricity. The negative effects are that most cities are being built currently without environmental consideration, and the existing lack of infrastructure plus high economic and social inequality is causing an expansion of slums. There's being lack of capital for improvements, and the urbanization right now is happening mostly in poor nations, so there's informal housing and informal employment, which is people working in jobs that are not recognized by the government, such as doing someone's laundry or being a seamstress. The demographic transition model is 4 different stages. Stage 1 is high birth and death rate. The population is really low. Stage 2 is high birth rate, but the death rate is decreasing. The population is rising really rapidly. Stage 3, the birth rate decreases. We're headed for stability. And Stage 4, low birth and death rate, and the population is roughly stable. Something important to look at when thinking about demographic transition is what can reduce fertility rates worldwide, which will probably be an exam question. Here's some answers for that. Education of women can reduce fertility rates worldwide, so can economic status and access to education and employment. Another important thing to know is the definition of carrying capacity. It is the maximum threshold population that a region may support. Now we're moving on to population density. So right here in this meme, he's saying the population density is too damn high, but that's actually a good thing. Population density is better when a population is packed more closely together, because then the resources don't have to travel as far, and that, of course, leads to a decrease in use of fossil fuels and so on, because the resources don't have to be transported so far, and cities are actually holding the answer to a sustainable future as of right now. The reason why we're looking at this right now is because the ozone layer intercepts UV radiation, so it helps us to not die in a fiery inferno, as I always say. We're looking at more specifically because back in the 70s, the ozone layer was being depleted because of chlorofluorocarbons. By 1985, there was a 40% reduction of ozone, which created the big hole in it, and the depletion, of course, is due to the accumulation of chemicals. But luckily, classic case of classical environmentalism, scientists caught this problem pretty early on and knew that the CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons, were causing it. So they set out, all the people of the world sort of set out to solve this problem, and it was solved through the Montreal Protocol, which is basically a bunch of countries all over the world, including the United States and Canada, just came together to reduce the amount of CFCs. And now the hole is virtually gone, as in an article I saw on January 5th of this year. So pretty awesome. Okay, greenhouse gases. First, we're going to be looking at where do greenhouse gases come from. They come from fossil fuels, land use conversion, which is also urbanization, cement production, rice paddies, waste dumps, livestock, fertilizer, industrial processes, and coolant. Now we're going to look at what they're made up of. What the greenhouse gases are made up of is water vapor, methane, ozone, not the same thing as the ozone layer, it's different, NTO and CO2. These make up 84% of greenhouse gases. The rest are smaller contributions. Now we're going to look at the Kyoto Protocol, which is in 2005. It set out to control global warming by setting greenhouse gas emission targets for developed countries. And almost every country was on board with it. I just think the United States pulled out when Bush was president. And another important question to look at is, why aren't we using renewable energy? We are currently relying so much on fossil fuels like oil and natural gas and coal. And obviously these are going to run out one day. So we do have to look into new options such as wind power and solar power. But the main argument against using them is that they're expensive, because there's already infrastructure for coal mining and oil drilling, but there isn't for solar power and wind power. But we will have to do it eventually. I mean, the other stuff's going to run out, so important to consider. And last part about greenhouse gases is to know the definition of anthropogenic radiative forcing, which is changes in heat balance caused by people. Acid rain. I made this meme, actually. Acid rain is the deposition of acids and substances by rainfall, snow, and dust particles falling from the atmosphere. The cause is emissions of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. Some of the effects of acid rain is that lakes become so acidic that fish and other life cannot survive. Forests have slower growth, and there's an increased chance of disease leading to death. Drinking water, because of acid rain, may have increased lead or aluminum, and then there's corrosion, like cars have literally just melted because of acid rain. Which two problems affect every continent? Here are the two answers: undernourishment and soil degradation. America the Great. We have this slide because there are two important facts to know about America for the test. Americans consume 28 times more than Ethiopians, and we spend a smaller amount of income on food compared to other countries because we have a lot of subsidies from the government for agriculture. Conservation biology, just important to know the definition, which is just this type of biology arose in response to loss of biodiversity, and it attempts to understand factors, forces, and processes that influence loss, protection, and restoration of species and habitat. It looks at population dynamics in terms of minimum viable numbers, necessary genetic diversity, and the effects of habitat disruption. Thank you for watching. I have a link to a Quizlet with some important terms and questions in the description, and good luck on the exam. Hope this helped.